I'm Liz Brailsford, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. Many of you know me better as an employee of WACA, and it's so nice to be on the other side. And let Bill handle it. Immigration is a global issue, a human-centered issue, or should be, and one which we should all care about. Whether it's the 2015 global refugee crisis or the current one that we're facing on the Poland-Belarus border, it's a critical issue. And as someone who now lives in Texas, it's literally in my backyard. This morning, we have a wonderful panel of speakers. So please help me in welcoming Theresa Cardinal Brown, Managing Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Alex Nowrasteh. How was it?
That's good enough.
That was all right. We practiced. I think I failed. Director of Immigration Studies at the Cato Institute. Kerri Talbot, Deputy Director of the Immigration Hub, and our moderator, Dara, a reporter at ProPublica. Please help me in welcoming them.
Thanks much to all of you. Thanks to WACA and to Bill for putting this together. So I have good news and bad news for y'all. The bad news is that to start an event like this by saying the US immigration system is broken would have been a cliche 10 years ago, and nothing has changed in the ensuing 10 years to make that statement less true. And I think that what we've seen in the last several years is that often the debate around immigration, both in the general public and definitely in Washington, can be in one of two modes. Either it's a crisis and crisis thinking dominates and the question is how to stop the crisis, or it is not a crisis and therefore there are often good long-term solutions that are posed, but very little urgency among key players to actually make those solutions happen. The good news is that we have an absolute all-star panel of folks who are both very, very cognizant of the policy realities at play here and smart and committed to what the end point at the end of the process is. So I want to kind of kick this off and bring us to a place where we can start envisioning what a better world would look like by asking each of our panelists to identify what is like one thing that you think both can be done right now and should be done right now on immigration. And then we can kind of build from there.
Okay, I guess I get to go first. You know, when we talk about what can be done, we have to understand sort of the reality that we're in right now, where Congress has been pretty much incapable of coming together to actually make changes. So we have to think about what can the executive branch do. And we have seen successive presidents try to do things by executive order, starting with President Obama in 2012 and DACA, and then President Trump had a bunch of executive orders, and President Biden has done so as well. And that's an obvious thing to try, but what we've also seen is that each of them have been stalled by litigation against some of those policies. So, you know, what can be done right now, I think, you know, speaking of what's urgent right now, I do think that we have an urgent humanitarian crisis at our border. And that is affecting significantly our politics around immigration in the United States, because for better or for worse, most Americans perceive immigration through the lens of what they see or think they see happening at the US-Mexico border. And that is going to require a lot of work, most of which I believe is and can be done by the executive branch. Starting with, they need to figure out the process they really want to enact to deal with people who arrive at the border. This administration has continued much of President Trump's policies at the border, particularly the Title 42 CDC order, which means that we're basically turning people around as fast as they come in. And we're not allowing people in to claim asylum or anything else. So that is a management tool, There are a lot of people who believe that that's not legal, and there are court cases pending right now about it. But the administration really hasn't taken a lot of steps to move toward an alternative, whether that's creating new forms of infrastructure at the border that can receive people in a better conditions than the traditional Border Patrol stations at the border, rethinking how we accept applicants for asylum at ports of entry, or frankly, redesigning how that system works for people at the border. That's probably issue number one, and all of that could be done by the administration. They've proposed some things by regulation, but they haven't really moved substantially quickly to implement anything new. The second thing is they have tried to do, and I think we're seeing today, maybe we'll see more on that, is what more can be done to work with countries in the region to manage what is now a hemispheric and global flow. So when President Biden came in, an awful lot of the issue was coming out of the Northern Triangle of Central America countries, but it is now the majority of people arriving are not from Mexico or from Central America. They're from Haiti, they're from Cuba, they're from Venezuela, they're from Brazil, they're from Ecuador, they're from Cameroon and India and Romania and many places around the world. And so pulling together a conversation about how the United States and Mexico, and frankly, and Canada can talk to and with all of the countries of the hemisphere about managing what is now a hemispheric migration flow. And that will involve international organizations and other things as well. I think those are the immediate steps that need to be taken to try to bring some order to what is not orderly right now at the US-Mexico border. And then, what else can be done for immigration system writ large? A lot of that really does depend on Congress buckling down and creating avenues for people that are realistic. We were just talking, our immigration system is essentially an iterative, kludged together conglomeration of different immigration policies that have added on one another that at the time may have made sense or was an exception to this rule because this didn't work well. And now the whole thing just really doesn't fit together in any logical way at all. And so an overall rethink is probably needed there. I'll stop.
The purpose of the US immigration system is to prohibit the vast majority of people who want to come here illegally from doing so. And from that perspective, from that macro perspective, it's incredibly successful. We take a look at the 10, 12 million illegal immigrants. There are estimates in that range of people who are here unlawfully. And that's actually a fairly small black market compared to what would be possible or likely under a system of zero enforcement of the laws that are here right now. So the system right now is basically doing what it's designed to do with some unintended consequences on the side. But in terms of what it does, it's succeeding miraculously at that bad goal. Now, I think that, of course, is a very bad goal that shouldn't be pursued. I think that the main number one problem with the legal immigration system that is the source of everything else is how difficult it is to come here. And in that regard, most of what can be done right now, there's really no options. But one thing that can be done is in December of 2020, Congress passed a law saying that you can have about 65,000 additional H-2B visas. H-2B visas are temporary worker visas, up to basically 10 months, lower skilled occupations in the United States that are seasonal. The Biden administration has only released about 22,000 of these, so there are about 42,000 sitting on the table. And I would say the number one thing that this administration could do right now is to let in about 42,000 more lawful workers that come to the United States at a time when there are about 10 million job openings. And that would relieve some of the pressure on the border. Some folks who are deciding to come here unlawfully could be channeled into this lawful system. I think that'd be a good thing. That'd be a humanitarian outcome. It would be better for the migrants who are able to get these visas economically. It'd be better for American employers and American consumers to be able to have some more lawful workers here in the United States. Of course, 42,000 is a small number in a country of 330 million people, but it's better than letting them sit on the table and rot. So that's the number one thing that I think that the administration could do right now.
Great, thank you. So definitely agree with what's been said so far. I mean, for me, the most important thing is to address the 11 million undocumented immigrants who are here in the US right now. We're a developed country. We shouldn't have an underclass of millions of people who do not have papers. We want folks to come forward, pay their taxes, and be able to work and live and travel. So many of these folks, the vast majority, have been in the US for over 10 years. 5 million of them were essential workers during the pandemic. And so it's really critical that we go ahead and move forward and legalize this group of people who, have family members here. They want to contribute to the economy. They are contributing to the economic recovery from the pandemic. So, right now in Congress, actually today, the House is looking at the Build Back Better Act, which does include a temporary program for people who've lived here for over 10 years. The program would let them live and work without fear of deportation, be able to travel back to their home countries for 10 years. Ideally, these folks would be able to become citizens. They've been here so long, they have children here, they have other family members, but unfortunately, it's been really challenging to get bipartisan agreement in Congress, and this may be the only thing that the Democrats can do on their own is use this budget reconciliation process that they're using right now to address many different social change issues, and one of them is immigration. It does also include some border-related port of entry infrastructure money as well as processing money in the package, and I think these investments will be important in terms of being able to, modernize the system, make sure people are able to come forward, register with the government, and be able to work and live without fear of deportation. Thanks.
We did not plan this, but I love how this fell out according to the traditional three, back when comprehensive immigration reform was the, buzzword and the strategy that was being used on legislation, what you'd hear is that there are three pillars of comprehensive immigration reform. There is the border, there is legalization, and there is future flows of legal immigrants. And we have all three of that perfectly here.
Piece of it, yeah.
But I want to start with the legalization leg, even because picking up on what Kerri said, because it seems that even though politically, as Theresa said, the way that Americans think about things is very much tied with, we can't legalize anyone until the border is secure, that policy-wise, they're two very different tracks because, as Kerri said, the unauthorized population is at this point, overwhelmingly well settled in the US. And I'm wondering what you folks think about if, say, the Build Back Better bill were to, pass in its current form, which I know is a whole separate, kernel of assumptions.
There's a lot of ifs there.
Given that what we've seen on legalization in the past has been not to go too into the weeds on this stuff, but I think it's fair to say that the last 35 years have been retroactive legalizations of various scopes paired with things that make it harder to for people to kind of get legalized on an ongoing basis, especially with some of the changes that were made in 1996. So, is that kind of the model for what for what's going to have to happen going forward, or is there a way to legalize that will finally be what Congress always says it's going to be whenever it passes a legalization bill, which is this is the last one we promise?
Well, if I can, I think you said that they're different issues. There are different populations, certainly, right? The people who are undocumented in the United States, as Kerri said, as you said, have mostly resided here for quite a long time. They are integrated into our country. They're integrated in mixed families with US citizen kids or US citizen spouse or a permanent resident, but because of their status, do not have a way under our current legal immigration system to legalize their status, absent Congress doing so. And of course, people arriving now at the border are going through some sort of process, and we don't know yet if they're going to remain undocumented in the United States or not. They're mostly applying for asylum and are waiting. But there is the linkage, I think, that most people put between the two is exactly what you said. Legalizing the undocumented here now is basically a remedial action. It is addressing the consequences of not having done anything on our legal immigration system for 35 years, but it does nothing to change the system for the next group of people coming in. right? We were to legalize everybody tomorrow, give them a path to citizenship, heck, grant them green cards tomorrow, we still have not fundamentally changed what happens to the next person who arrives in the United States. And so if a legalization is retroactive and what's being considered in reconciliation would have a 10-year look back, we're still leaving some undocumented on the table, if you will, undocumented people in the United States, and we haven't done anything to change what happens to the next group. So I think that's why people think that there is wide popular support for legalization for long-term residents of the United States. That's true in both parties. But it comes with this idea that we don't want to have to keep doing legalizations. I think there are a couple of different ways to address that conundrum. One, I don't think that there is any way, and I think this is where the border debate goes off the rails very quickly. We cannot seal our border. It's just not going to happen. We will always have some irregular flow. The question is, how do we manage the majority of migration happening at the border and funnel it into legal channels as much as possible so that that smaller remnant is more manageable? But secondly, we need to think about the legal immigration system that prevents most people who want to come here from coming here. So this is why comprehensive immigration reform, not just as a political tactic, but as a policy makes sense, because our system is a system. And we fix one part and we don't fix another, we're leaving problems on the table. So, I mean, if Democrats are successful in passing reconciliation and immigration is on it, that's not the end. Nobody can wash their hands and go, we did that, now we're done. Like, no, we have a lot more to do. And I think these issues will always keep coming back around.
So almost all American policy for my entire life has been reactive to problems. I don't know if it's ever been any different. Maybe it's my myopia, historical myopia that says that. But we've never really been sort of forward-thinking in policy, especially on immigration policy, in a long time. But we've had amnesties in this country, for instance, for immigration since the 1920s. Even the only way that I could see us not having them going forward is if we had such a liberal and open immigration system that basically anybody could come here who wanted to. That's basically the only way that there would be zero black market going forward, essentially zero. And that I don't think is going to happen either, unfortunately. But then taking a look at what's going forward, one of the things that I think when you listen to experts or people talking about this topic is, we're so in the weeds that we're able to separate these different areas like legal immigration, border security, legalization, and all of them are important. But when you talk to folks out there who aren't experts and who don't sort of live and breathe this stuff, it's all sort of the same thing. And so there's this finding in political psychology called perceptions of chaos. And when people view something as chaotic and out of control, their reaction is not, well, we should liberalize that so that then we can have control of it and it can be legal and it can be regulated. That's not the reaction that people have. The reaction is to throw police officers at it and to throw Border Patrol agents at it and to throw a wall at it and to throw more control at these things. But that makes everything worse, because that makes and deepens the black market, deepens the benefits of people trying to break the law eventually. And that is, I think, this sort of cycle that we're in. It's a catch-22 of immigration reform, is that in order to have immigration reform that's positive, there needs to be control of the border and these other areas of immigration. But in order to do that, you need to have a liberal and open immigration policy, so it needs to be reformed. So what you really need is a politician to be brave.
There's a lot of that. There's a lot of brave politicians out there, right?
And to be brave and to recognize this and to do something about it using the powers that they have. And this might also be sort of my naivete about American politics, but historically, but we don't have that right now to sort of break that cycle that we're in. So they broke it during the Great Depression with Prohibition, which had this disastrous cycle as well. Different topic, of course, but they broke it because there was a fiscal crisis in the United States and FDR needed revenue to fund a New Deal. And that's basically why they legalized alcohol then and broke that cycle. So what's the thing that's going to get the government to break this cycle now for immigration? I'm constantly searching for it, and if you have any ideas, please email me afterwards.
It did seem for a hot minute like in 2020 that the script flipped on unauthorized workers and that the very, like the idea that we should value people for their work, which had been anathema on the left and right of the immigration debate for different reasons, got turned into this veneration of essential workers. And for like a very brief period, it did look like that was going to change the underlying politics of it. And I wonder why that dissipated.
So I think part of the reason also why that changed is you take a look at, like I say, border apprehensions by month, March, April of 2020 were basically like the lowest of my entire life.
Right, because even the smugglers didn't want to operate in the pandemic, essentially.
And people didn't want to come here because there were no jobs, right? I mean, that's the thing that we also, I think, miss as immigration experts. I think a lot about what I think about, which is not comfortable. But part of this is it's not like immigration isn't always affected just by immigration policy, but by lots of other things going on. And I think just not realizing, and I know people on this panel realize this, right? But we don't think about it all the time is people weren't coming in mid-2020 partly because there were no jobs, because the economy was in severe recession during the pandemic. And now that there are 10 million job openings, a lot more people are coming. And sure, government policy, of course, has an impact on this. What Joe Biden and the courts and everybody else and Donald Trump are doing has an impact on this, right? But there are lots of factors affecting this. And we can't just focus on what we're doing and what we review and what Congress does and what the administration does. Lots of other things count.
Sorry, Kerri, I colloquied Alex instead
No, not at all. No, definitely agree that we need a fundamental reset. I mean, it's been over 50 years since there's been sort of a dramatic change to the immigration system, and so it's clearly outdated and needs to be reformed more broadly than just this temporary patch that is in the bill that's moving through Congress. Certainly we need a path to citizenship, we need to look at future flows, and there are other areas that we need to address. Congress for many years was able to deal with the undocumented in the US by using this registry statute that has been around for over 100 years, and they would just say, look, if you've managed to be in the US for X many years, 10, 20 years, then you can go ahead and apply and regularize your status. But unfortunately, immigration's become so politicized and so divisive in some ways at the national level and at the state level too, that that registry statute hasn't been updated since the 70s. And so, people have been here now for decades. And it's just fundamentally, it doesn't make sense for our economy. It's an unfair situation. And we do definitely need a broader reset for sure.
So, I mean, this is of course totally proved me wrong because it turns out it's in fact impossible to talk about one pillar without implicating everything else. But I wanted to pivot off something that Alex said about the job openings, because while that is true, it is also true that even when there weren't jobs in the US, that remittances being sent by immigrants in the US rebounded really quickly, even before the job market did, because even people who had themselves lost their jobs in the US were saying, well, yeah, things aren't great for me here, but things are so much worse for my family back home that even though I don't really have income right now, I'm gonna scrape together what I can to send things home, which is as good an illustration as any of, the global displacement pressures that we're seeing now have a great deal to do with circumstances in which people feel like they genuinely have no option but to leave. What are called the push factors in, the classical model of, when people come to the US is that there are push factors, which are things are bad in your home country, and there are pull factors, which is you want to come to the US. And if you subscribe to that model, then the push factors, which are the things that are ostensibly outside the US's control, have just been, have stayed at a sustained level of being very pushy, if you will. So, is there, this is where the Biden administration tends to come in and talk about root causes, right? Like the Obama administration before it, that the real answer is to stop people from wanting to leave by making their home countries appealing enough. is that A, feasible solution, B, something that can be accomplished in like a reasonable enough time period? And how does that interact with the very urgent needs of people feeling they need to leave right now?
Yeah. So the one thing I will say about US immigration politics is that everyone overestimates the impact that US policy has on migrants. They are not listening to our political debates for the most part. They're not even necessarily listening to the messages coming from the US government. They are looking around at the situation they have where they are. And the very first decision a migrant makes is not where do I go, it's I have to leave, right? So it's what are the factors that go into that decision? And then they say, well, how can I leave? Where do I go? What are my means? And they're much more likely to listen to their relative, their neighbor, their person from their village who has already come and ask them what the situation is like than they are to go online and look up what the actual rules and regulations are, right? Like that's not how it works. It's informal networks. And then you have what I call the X factor, the enabling factor of criminal business organizations that have a monetary incentive to encourage and facilitate illegal migration. And they also have a say in this. And they actively recruit and they actively sell their travel plans. And those are the factors that implicate migration a lot more than whatever the official government policy is at any given moment. And those are also very long-term factors. So, the root causes strategy is important, in part because I think from a foreign policy standpoint, the United States has ignored our backyard for quite a few years. We had a whole lot of, I'd say, backlash from activities that happened in the 80s. And then we sort of said, oh, well, we did really badly, so we're just going to be hands off for a while. And things have not gotten appreciably better in a lot of the Western Hemisphere. So, is the United States right to try to engage in developing these countries? Yes. Should we be the lead one? Maybe not. That's why I hope Canada will engage and other countries in the region will engage, and why I think we need to do this on a more hemispheric basis. But that's going to take decades, right? There's a lot of issues that need to be addressed to make those countries places that can sustain their own economies, provide living conditions that are valid for the people that are there. In the meantime, we still have to manage what is going to happen. Our economy matters significantly, but so do these factors that cause people to leave. So I think that's why we talk about managing the migration flow rather than stopping it or preventing it or whatever. I think we need to have a system that works to manage it as best we can, understanding all of these factors. And we try to influence it where we can. But the one thing I think that we need to understand is particularly deterrence-based policies, which is essentially what our border strategy has been for 3 decades. Deterrence has a declining impact in relation to the desperation of a migrant. And what we have seen really over the last 20 years is increasing desperation. And we have ratcheted up deterrence to try to impact that to the point where a lot of people now look at what we're doing at the border and going, well, President Trump faced that when he decided that separating kids from the families was an effective deterrent. And the American public said, maybe that's too much, right? So there's a limit to what is tolerable, I think. And personally, I would say there's a limit to what's humane in a society like the United States. But there's also diminishing returns on effectiveness.
So generally in the world, there's exceptions to this, but generally the most destitute people are not the ones who move. Moving is expensive. And so what we see in this relationship globally is that emigration with an E, people leaving, generally peaks around GDP per capita in a country about $9,000. So what is something to consider is that if you have a country with GDP per capita below $9,000 and the United States or other countries were to institute policies to help it grow economically, you would likely see an increase in outmigration. until you get to beyond this point. So that's something to consider here, and a lot of Latin American countries fit into that category. Where if they did have rapid economic growth over the next couple of years to catch up or to the United States or these other countries, you would see an increase in immigration because now people have the resources to leave. And if you suddenly are making $8,000 or $10,000 in one of these countries, but now you can afford to move to the United States and get a wage increase of 4 to 6 times higher, which is about what it is from Central America to the United States, depending on your education experience, then you're going to see these types of problems. Or these types of issues go on. That, of course, leaves on the table whether the US government can actually effectively do things to help other countries develop. I think the evidence for that is basically zero. Bill Easterly at New York University has written a lot about a lot of these efforts over time. There are some things the US government can do, sort of not a development-led strategy, but a strategy that does help unintentionally. One is, of course, to liberalize immigration. Because I think, like Dara said, these folks do send back remittances to their home countries. I believe it's Honduras, it's El Salvador, about 20% of GDP remittances. What folks do with remittances in these home countries is they generally invest in businesses, they invest in acquiring human capital for their children, which is education and skills, and other things like that. So that's good. Another one is freer trade. That generally helps economic growth in a lot of these areas. But you're going to get to the point where in a lot of these places, a little bit more growth will actually lead to a little bit more out-migration. So that's something to always consider. But in the long run, the extreme long run, of course, development is always good. That's why we don't have very many immigrants from Norway, to the consternation of our former president.
On that note. So the U.S. is in the midst of a summit with Mexico and Canada right now. And, I do hope and believe they're talking about regional approaches to the situation in Central America and there's actually quite a bit of migration also from Venezuela as well, and Haiti. So hopefully they're going to be discussing, how they can deal with this in a more multilateral and also more regional framework. There has been obviously a lot of discussion between Mexico and the United States, but there's certainly a long way to go, I think, in terms of, making sure that there's a system that's, appropriately and humanely deals with flows from Central America. Many of those folks are coming for asylum. They actually have valid asylum claims. Some are coming for economic purposes. There's ways to address those issues in a fair manner, making sure people are able to have their claims processed quickly and with legal counsel. And there are ways to make sure that people receive information about how to comply with U.S. immigration law, with our court procedures here. Unfortunately, our deterrence-based strategy is really very dated in terms of, just looking, it was really designed more for adult single males who are coming to work and just sort of pushing them back into Central America. Whereas right now we have a situation where it's a lot of families, it's a lot of children coming by themselves. It's people fleeing Haiti after the horrible situations there and the country's completely unstable. And this type of migration flow is definitely requires a different approach than just attempting to push people back. As folks mentioned, if the situation is dire enough, people will continue to come back, which is what we're seeing at the border now, a high rate of recidivism due to Trump policies like Title 42, which are still in place and that attempt to push people back quickly. And people just will turn back around and try again if the situation is dire enough. And so really it's learning how to deal with the more humanitarian-based flow of migrants at the border is what we need to work on.
We're gonna open this up to questions in just a couple of minutes. I want to do a lightning round first, pivoting off something Kerri just said about the, the kind of accommodating the shift to humanitarian flow, which is that, as you mentioned, Kerri, the difficulty of discerning who has a valid asylum claim under current U.S. law, like often in practice takes several years of people waiting in limbo. What what can be done in y'all's view to reduce the gap between somebody coming to the US and finding out if they actually are deemed an asylum seeker or an economic migrant and sent, an asylum seeker and allowed to stay, or an economic migrant and sent home?
Yeah, a couple things. One is obviously having availability of counsel is helpful in terms of making sure people have a fair process. But then the US has also been looking at allowing USCIS, which is the benefits granting agency, the agency that can grant asylum affirmatively or not in court, but basically someone comes forward, they ask for asylum, and that agency can go ahead and grant it to them, allowing those officers to actually adjudicate claims up front without having to put everyone through the court system. That I think is helpful. But I'll turn it over to other folks.
I think there are two main things that I would do. Number one, sorry to break the rules. Number one is to try to separate, to bring out of the flow the economic migrants prior to their arrival by channeling some of them into a lawful system related to what I said earlier. I think that's a good thing to sort of reduce that, because I do think the legitimacy of the asylum system is under threat by perceptions of what's happening. And then the second one would be to try to expand the refugee system, which is different from asylum. It's basically having people come from overseas directly on this visa refugee system, so that they come in as humanitarians from abroad rather than having to be channeled into this asylum system where they basically have to show up and be on US soil when they ask for humanitarian assistance. And I think the best way to do that is to create and to revive old systems of private sponsorship, so that individuals, religious communities, organizations, whatever, can sponsor these individuals to come lawfully and help them get established in the US for humanitarian reasons, similar to what Canada does through its immigration and refugee system.
Yeah, so they took two of the things I was going to say. I mean, we have to reform the way we adjudicate asylum cases in the United States. Right now, anyone who comes in between a port of entry, even if they ask for asylum, is put into immigration deportation proceedings through which they can ask for asylum. That system is completely backlogged, so that can take 2 or 3 years to be decided. That, in turn, means that there's no sort of rapid adjudication that can tell people whether or not they're going to get to stay or not. And so I do think that provides some sort of reason why people continue to try to arrive and get into that system. So a way that allows a more rapid adjudication for people who arrive at the border with counsel and due process, and particularly not requiring them to go into an already backlogged immigration court system. Let's set up a whole separate system for border arrivals and let it go through that. I think makes more sense. I agree, we only have currently, I think, 5,000 of the designated refugee slots for all of the Western Hemisphere, which is a pittance. We have not traditionally held out refugee processing in the Western Hemisphere that much. So reinvigorating and rethinking that on a multilateral basis. Let's work with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Let's work with the International Organization for Migration. Let's work with other countries in the hemisphere to beef up refugee resettlement throughout the Western Hemisphere. Not everybody needs to be resettled to the United States. Maybe some could go to Canada or Mexico or Costa Rica or Peru, or pick another country that seems to be better off than where they are, and see if we can do that way. I think that's definitely needed. I think the last thing maybe rapidly that could be done is maybe today, get Mexico to agree to let us help them with their own asylum system. They're getting more asylum applications than they ever have been before too, and it's completely overburdened, and that implicates how many people decide to come here. So if we could help them with their system, that would help us also.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Nikolina Angelkova. I'm from Bulgaria, Bulgarian Member of Parliament and former Minister of Transport and Tourism for 7 years. Well, Bulgaria is an external border of the European Union, and we are experiencing a very big challenge as regarding the immigration process now ongoing with everything that is happening in the Middle East. And of course, Bulgaria is taking part in all the commitments and obligation which the European Union has as regarding the quota for the migrants, and also what we could do and observe. And in 2015, we managed to have an agreement with Turkey because, of course, they're coming from there. But the main challenge is first how to, as you rightly said, integrate the migrants if they want to be integrated. And in particular in our country, and second, how the local community accept that. So I wanted to ask you if you have any particular policy to convince the locals to accept somehow the migrants, because in Bulgaria this is very difficult. Our government built up migrant centers in different cities, but unfortunately it's so difficult to educate locals that they have to behave as well and try to integrate the migrants that are coming. So that's really a great challenge, I consider. Thank you for your thoughts on that.
So one of the best predictors of especially like refugee integration, and there's a good paper on this in the American Economic Review about Switzerland and their experience with refugees, because in Switzerland there are a bunch of different cantons with radically different labor market policies when it comes to refugees, and one of the big policies that makes a difference is trying to integrate those who can work in the labor market as fast as possible. It's good for the refugees in that they gain some self-confidence, some support for themselves. They see themselves as having a future when they can work. And also generally, there's problems with locals in some situations. Sometimes they think, oh, these foreigners are taking my jobs. But other times people have the reaction, locals have the reaction of, well, they're not a burden, as much of a burden. So in the long term, I think one of the most important things is making sure that these individuals can work as soon as possible. And there's a wide range of policies in EU countries about this, where some prohibit asylum seekers and refugees from working, sometimes for years by law. Others try to get them working very rapidly. So I'm not sure what the situation is in Bulgaria, but I think that would be something to try to take a look at, is to try to integrate them into the labor force and the economy as fast as possible.
We try to do so, but the language barrier is really huge because our language is very particular and it's spoken only in our country. So that really makes the situation much more challenging than in the other countries. But thank you for your comments.
Yes, thank you very much for coming. I'd like to look at sort of the other end of immigration. I'm from World Boston. We have these students who come here to this country. They study. They have incredible skills. In an act of what I can only describe as inconceivable madness, we kick them out. You get these kids from MIT. They graduate with these master's degrees in computer science. They actually know how the phone works. I can barely turn mine on. They know everything that works inside it, and then we kick them out. And I wonder if we can move towards, I believe, please correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that Canada and Australia have like a point system. Mm-hmm. You can emigrate there if you have certain skills and linguistic skills, again, I don't know the specific deal. I know that we have an investment. If you invest so much money in the US, you can get a visa. But I like to see that too, that not sort of these refugees coming in, and they're obviously, they let them in too to do some of the work here. But the people on the other end of it, these highly educated, immigrant students, and then to just, okay, you're done, you got your degree, thank you, boot. I mean, I think that strikes me as crazy. We could do something on that end too to encourage those people to stay, because they contribute a lot. Mm-hmm. How many of those startups in Silicon Valley, or even in Boston, are started by them?
I mean, Alex said it up front. Our system is designed to keep people out, not let people in, right? And it's designed in a lot of ways. The student visa, for example, in order to qualify as a foreign student in the United States, you first have to prove to the consular officer that you never intend to immigrate. So we start out with the presumption that you're not allowed to stay. We'll let you in to study for a while, and you're not allowed to stay. And there are ways that students can stay. It involves a whole lot of hurdles and a whole lot of jumping through hoops and a whole lot of hope I get an employer willing to pay the time, energy, and effort to sponsor me, and that there's a visa number available and I can do it. And I think that part of it is this concept that American immigration system has been designed under, honestly, since the 1920s, of an exclusionary system rather than an inclusionary system. Our first immigration laws were about exclusion, who can't come. We didn't create categories under which we said people could come until like the 1950s. If you look at systems like Canada and Australia, they have an inclusionary system. And you can see it in how they talk about it, right? Canada's system has annual targets of migration they want to reach. We have caps. So just in the way they talk about it, their system is designed to be inclusionary, their system is designed to be open because they recognize immigration as a positive for the country. The United States has always been very ambivalent about migration, and that is reflected in how our laws are crafted.
And I want to riff off something that Theresa said. In almost every area of our peculiar system of Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence, everything is allowed except that which is specifically prohibited in the law. That's how it works. Everything's allowed, but there are some exceptions. Immigration is the opposite. Nothing is allowed except that which Congress has specifically identified as can come in. So that's the way that system works. When it comes to high-skilled individuals, you mentioned this point system. I'm not a big fan of a point system. And the point system is the idea that the immigration system, people have specific skills, they speak languages, education, they're a certain age, and if they get a certain number of points, and they're allowed to come to the United States, or to Canada in this case, or Australia to work. That, of course, means that we think that politicians are really good at deciding which skills are going to be great in the labor market. One of the unintentional, and so one of the unintentional good things about the American immigration system is that a lot of the economic visas are employer-driven, and that they sort of identify individuals, and they're like, we really like this person, we want to hire them. Because there's a lot of things that are, you can't predict exactly who's going to do well in the United States. Like, you can look at their paper, and there's some things correlated with this, but there's a certain drive and ambition that just you can't measure on paper. And our system is pretty good at identifying that. It's just the problem is the numbers are so low that it's ridiculous and leads to a lot of these problems that you are talking about. A lot of people who are highly skilled, who want to be here, who are motivated to be here, are just simply not able to do so, are not able to start firms, are not able to take that chance, are not able to take that risk. And so US policy basically says, go back to India, go back to China, after you got your American training. And it's just ludicrous. It's totally nuts. It's totally backwards. But that seems to be the norm in most American policy. It's really amazing how successful this country is, given the quality of laws that are in place here. It's actually that's the miracle.
I like to say that we succeed in spite of our immigration system. Immigrants succeed in the United States in spite of our immigration system.
Yeah.
I think maybe it's like a gauntlet, right? If you can make your way all the way through that, you're probably going to do it.
That's the old joke. That's the old joke is the guy who can be able to cross the border unlawfully and figure it out is so industrious and thoughtful and plans ahead, but that person's great. Hong Kong and that's an old joke, right? But Hong Kong actually used to have this immigration system where if you were coming from China, they would try to stop you from coming in the border. But if you got to this one government office downtown, you could get legalized. And that's just a ridiculous system in a lot of ways. It's a joke. It should be the topic of a really bad TV series. But in a way, it does a selection mechanism for people who are planning ahead and pretty thoughtful.
Unfortunately, it's really hard on the immigrants themselves.
No, that's the thing,
downside.
right?
It's really bad for them.
We're joking about this, and the thing that is always here and is part of this conversation, and that it's sort of implicitly here, but it always needs to be stated, is that we're talking about individuals. It's almost why I hate the word immigration, because you're talking about tens of millions of people who are individuals who have their own personal motivations for wanting to come to the United States, who have people who are here who have their own personal motivations who wanted to hire them or marry them or live with them or sell to them or whatnot. And these motivations range the gamut from not too good to the most noble thing you've ever heard. And that honestly gets lost a lot in this conversation. We're talking about people, we're talking about individuals.
I have no idea how we're doing on time. Probably not super well.
11:25.
Oh, okay. We're not doing as
10
badly as I
minutes.
thought. We can take at least one more question, unless Kerri, you have thoughts on point systems. All right.
Hi, Naples Council. So, just one quick comment. In the Naples area and most of Florida, we have a huge population of Hispanic immigrants. Many of them are still illegal, but they're still able to work. In my community, a lot of the people who do the gardening, the exterior work, are illegal, but they're able to make money. However that happens, it happens, and they're very well behaved, and I think we're very lucky to have them. That's just one comment. The reason I stand up here today is that I think a fundamental truth of the immigration conversation is that it comes down to politics. Sure. There's one political party that benefits from having all this chaos at the border. And my question to you is, the current administration, I think, could do a better job in explaining what's happening in the southern border. And, for instance, the comment that we have more immigrants coming in now because our economy is doing better. I've never heard the administration refer to that as a reason. And I just feel that the immigration issue will be a #1 topic in the coming elections next year. And can't the administration do a better job of explaining what it's doing and why it's doing this?
I actually do want to step in just for a correction of fact, because I actually have heard Press Secretary Jen Psaki say that there are people coming because the economy is so good. And the reason that I heard, I don't usually watch White House press conferences. That comment came across my radar because it was being roundly mocked, because it was seen as such transparent spin. Because the politics of the current border situation in DC are so uniformly, how do we stop this, that explaining why it happened is, frankly, left to members of my profession, rather than seen as something that it's rather than as a legitimate policy response.
Yeah, I will say, coming from a place called the Bipartisan Policy Center, I feel like it's necessary for me to say that the politics of immigration, although they've always been challenging, have not been so partisan. In the mid-90s, up until probably early 2000s, you had coalitions of Democrats and Republicans that were primarily pro-immigration, and you had some cohorts on both parties that were primarily against it. Think about pro-business Republicans and civil liberties Democrats coming together, but then you had sort of a more nationalist Republicans and, frankly, labor Democrats who were skeptical. And that was the way the immigration debate put it out. It wasn't so Democrats are one way and Republicans are another. That's a relatively recent phenomenon. It started before President Trump took office, and he supercharged it. So now the Democratic Party is much more homogeneous in terms of, I think, its pro-immigration bent, but still heavily leaning toward humanitarian, asylum, legalization, family-based migration, and highly skeptical of employment-based migration. And the business wing of the Republican Party is still there, but diminished, and the nationalist, populist, sort of more anti-immigrant side is more, and that is working for the parties now. Now it's become, because it's become that way, they're now making it an electoral issue, right? Because they're using it to drive their own bases. It never used to have that kind of electoral connotation, and now it does. And so the politics have gotten a lot harder because for winning elections, each side believes they can make the other side pay for their immigration stance. But it's not an incentive to actually do anything or fix it. And that's kind of where we're stuck. And I will say, having worked for administrations of both Republican and Democratic Party in the Department of Homeland Security, I have never seen a presidency or any executive branch do a good job of explaining migration, ever.
I do agree that I think it would be helpful to have more conversation at the national level and from the administration. And we've done a lot of research on sort of where public opinion is, and there's really broad support. typically see results in sort of the 70% range for a system that lets people get on a path to citizenship while building a border system that's humane and fair and, you know, has efficient but humane processing. You know, that all polls extremely well. People generally agree on what the system should look like. It's just unfortunate that, you know, especially during the Trump administration, it was so politicized, and I think it's gonna take quite a long time to recover from that, especially, you know, depending who runs in the next presidential. It's you know, we really went sort of way in the opposite direction of sort of where public opinion is, with the Trump policies really sort of taking us back to a much more restrictive stance than I think reflects where, you know, most of America is. And so I think it's gonna take us quite a while to sort of have the administration feeling comfortable in putting out their views of what they think is right.
And then the wrinkle on that, because that's 100% correct. The wrinkle is on the polling is the intensity of belief.
Yeah.
So this is the thing, is like people who are pro-immigration, it's like, you know, their third or fourth biggest issue. They don't really change their vote based on it. But people who are opposed, it's their number one issue, and they vote on it. And when you dig into a Gallup poll, which asks these questions in detail, they have a subsection where they're like, are you dissatisfied with the immigration system? What do you want to do? And of those dissatisfied, many, many more want to cut immigration than want to liberalize it. It's narrowing, actually, considerably during the Trump administration. It's moving in the right direction from my perspective, but that intensity gap is still there.
Huge.
And just take a look at your hate mail. Like, I mean, I just, you know, I
My
get,
Twitter feed.
yeah, I mean, like the people who are anti-immigration, you know, they get some hate mail too. But like the intensity in the ratio is like dramatic. Like, I mean, you know, the number of times I talk to police officers because of the death threats I get is like, I have cards in my office, right? And like, how many people have a DC concealed carry permit, right? Like, not too many, but a lot of pro-immigration people do because of this type of stuff. Maybe not a lot, but a few.
All right, now that we've basically carried this to DC gun policy, this is probably a good place to wrap up. Thanks so much to all y'all. Thank you guys for letting us have this conversation in front of you.